your classmates in a debate, right? How do you challenge a claim? So you're hearing things in your debate that your opponents are saying, and then you want to challenge them. And that's called refutation. And obviously it occurs
Vice President Biden, I'd like to bring you in
everywhere.
an awful lot of time 10 years ago trying to pass a bill far less.
And I'm not going to bore you with more political debates, but essentially it's anytime you hear something and you have to challenge what was said. And there's different strategies. And I want you to think about which one of these would be useful to you. So what's happening when you're in the debate is you're listening to what the other side is saying. And sometimes you're going to hear something, you're like, oh, I disagree with that moment, with that point, that specific aspect that they're discussing. That is what I disagree with. And that's called the point of stasis. Okay? This is the exact moment when you disagree with what someone is saying. And that's why you're keeping notes. Because as you're sort of tracking their arguments and you're writing something down, you're like, that doesn't make sense. Or I really disagree with that point that is made, then that's your point of stasis, and you write it down and circle it. And that's where you want to challenge them. Okay? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to focus on the arguments that the other side has said that you think have the biggest holes, right? And by hole, I mean biggest weakness. And that weakness can be anywhere. Their claim could be very, very weak, right? Doesn't quite make sense. It's unclear. Maybe there was a hole in their evidence, right? You heard a source or you heard the evidence, but it doesn't really prove anything. Maybe the hole or the weakness comes from the source, right? They're citing a source and you're like, that's such a biased source, or that's such a Wikipedia, come on, right? You could challenge the source. Or their warrant, right? When they're putting everything together and they're trying to clarify everything, and you disagree with how they're forming these links. You could disagree on all of this, okay? So again, you're finding the point of stasis. What do you disagree with? And then you dig a little bit deeper. Are you disagreeing with their claim, with their evidence, with their source, or their warrant, what it all means? So you found your point of stasis, right? So in the debates we just heard, I think Brooklyn had a couple of refutations, and she was discussing, I think in terms of refuting abusive environment that can occur in a homeschooling situation. So here's the tactics. This is how you can actually challenge. One is called refutation by denial. And all that means is you're just saying someone's wrong. What you just said is inaccurate. What you just said is wrong. You're just straight out challenging what someone has said, and you're stating that they're wrong. Now, how can you do that? How can you prove it? Well, you can challenge their evidence, right? You can flat out challenge that they are wrong by the validity of their evidence. You can say the evidence that you're using doesn't make sense. It's inaccurate, and because of that, your claim is wrong. Right? So say if you hear a debate, the statistics about uninsured Americans provided by my opponent is clearly inaccurate. They were taken in 2000, and a lot has changed in the last 20 years. Right? So you can show that someone is wrong, but you then will have to prove how they're wrong. And the easiest way to do that is by challenging the evidence. So this is flat out just saying someone's wrong. The second is called mitigation, and mitigation just means to decrease or minimize the importance of something. So this is a little bit different than denial. You're not saying that someone's wrong, but you're weakening or lessening their argument. Right? My opponent has argued that 40 million or 15% of uninsured Americans provide ample reasons to revamp the healthcare system. But this is at risk of disturbing the other 85% of Americans who are happy with their insurance. Right? So if someone was to bring out statistics that say, well, 10% of Americans feel this is the way it should be, and that's their main evidence to put forth that claim or that argument, you're trying to minimize it and say, well, but it's only 10%. Or it's only 15%. What about the other 85% or 95%? So in this regard, you're not necessarily challenging or denying what they're saying. You're just weakening its strength. And the last is called turning the tables. And just as this sounds, this is when your opponent says something, and when you hear it, you're like, hey, that actually supports my argument. So proponents of gun control claim stricter gun laws will keep more guns off the street, making people safer. But this only makes it harder for law-abiding citizens to get guns, actually making it less safe for them. So this is often used where you're saying, well, you're restricting gun access, and that should make everyone safer. But then some people flip it and say, but you're preventing law-abiding citizens from getting guns to defend themselves, thus making them less safe. You're trying to flip or turn the tables. All right, so we have those three. Are you flat out denying someone they're wrong? Are you weakening what they're saying? Or are you trying to completely flip it, right? What you're saying actually benefits my side. So you can think about that. So then the question is, how do you actually voice or present this refutation? So there's one is called refutation by questioning. This is when you actually ask a question of the debater. So let's say our debaters are arguing, and it's at this point where you want to challenge what the speaker is currently saying. You would actually ask them a question during the debate. And this is called cross-examination. And what you do is you just ask very succinct questions, right? You try and get them to expose any potential weaknesses that they might have, right? So where did you get your statistics? Or when were those statistics taken? And at that point, because maybe you already know that statistic came from 2000, you would then highlight that, right? Well, that's a very outdated statistic, don't you think? So you can ask questions of the opposing side as a way to highlight their weaknesses. And it's very useful because if you know that they have a weakness in their argument and they basically expressed it, you can jot that down and save that for later. So when it's your turn to speak, you can then reemphasize, well, look, my opponents here are using very outdated information upon which they're basing most of their claims. Because that information is so outdated, obviously their claims are inaccurate, and thus their proposition is wrong or weak. So you can use that information at a later time. The other way of doing it is, opposed to asking questions, you can have a declarative refutation. And this is when in your constructive speeches, this is when you actually state the criticisms. And again, Brooklyn started off her constructive speech with a declarative refutation. She, right off the bat, challenged what the previous speaker had said. Right? Now, how do you do this? Well, it's pretty straightforward, and you do this in your own lives. You state what the other side has said. You explain why they're wrong. And it's at this point where you try to turn the table, right? You state your position and explain why you're right. So you're trying to take away the power of the other side's argument, of their evidence, of their claims, and you're trying to say, well, they're not right. In fact, I'm right, and here's why. You're trying to take the wind out of their sails. And you do this during your constructive speech. And again, that's why you're taking notes and jotting down what the other side said, mainly to find their weaknesses that you want to expose when it's your time to do your constructive speech. So here's an example. The opposing team has made a claim that legalizing euthanasia will cause high risk of abuse of the procedure, which might lead to deaths of innocent people. So if you remember, euthanasia is physician-assisted suicide, or what's the current name? End of Life Option Act. And it's the ability for those that are terminally ill to be able to end their life if they so choose. So this person's arguing, well, they're saying that if it's to be legalized, that there's going to be a lot of abuse of this procedure, right? So they're stating the other side's position. Now they want to explain how they're wrong. We believe that this claim is incorrect, right? They're wrong. Euthanasia is a procedure that is very hard to abuse because of all the regulations in place. Euthanasia is a procedure that is accessible only to a very limited amount of people, terminally ill patients that have no prospect of long-term survival. It is difficult to access, and thus abuse will not occur. So then you're trying to flip it, right? Now you're stating your proposition or your position. On the other hand, we have shown you that the real risk of abuse happens when euthanasia is not legal. And the only way people in need can access it through illegal means, and thus jeopardizing far more people. The risk of abuse, and this is where you're really the chunk of your argument, right? The risk of abuse is reduced with proper governmental regulations over the procedure. Even if euthanasia is not legal, people will still be terminally ill. They will look for help on the black market. However, the government has no control over the black market, and therefore it cannot prevent abuse from happening. In the world where euthanasia is not legal, there would be more undesired suffering, either through botched procedures or because there would be insufficient regulation of consent. Both sides of this debate desire a world with less unnecessary suffering. Our side can better achieve it by providing people the access to the safe and regulated procedure that would end their pain. So again, in this constructive speech, the speaker basically restated what the other side, their main argument, explained why it's wrong, explained your side of the story, and explained why you're right. And as we do our next debate, I think you'll see it's much easier and more effective to do that because you could jump off of what they're saying and then flip it and emphasize your argument or what you're saying. Okay? So, refutation, again, this is when you're challenging someone. And you can do this by stating that someone is wrong, flat out saying that they're wrong. You could do this by minimizing what they're saying or minimizing their arguments, weakening their arguments. And lastly, you can do this by turning the tables. And that's where you're trying to flip the argument so that it basically supports your side. So these are the different ways, right? Wrong, minimize, or flipping it. Now, how do you do it? Well, you can do it through cross-examination, where you ask a question of the person and you get them to almost voice their mistake or the weakness of their argument. Or you state it during your constructive speech. All right. For our upcoming debates, the next round of debates, we are going to have a cross-examination section. So after each constructive speech, the opposing side will be allowed to ask one core question, right, to which you will have to address. Not this round of speeches, but or debates, the next round. All right. So think about all these terms and think about how you can apply them in your upcoming future debates. Okay.